tried to find a quote that was relevant to introduce you with, and this is a little bit long, and I don't know, we'll see, but I wonder how, I'm going to ask you later at dinner how relevant you think this is to what you're going to talk about. It's from a time that David Sedaris was on This American Life. Okay. You know what it is.
Yeah, you take him doing Billie Holiday?
Yeah. So he can do a really great Billie Holiday voice. So he says, the following evening I showed up for my lesson. Oh, he's learning to play guitar. At this time, when asked if I practiced, I told the tracing in a matter-of-fact tone of voice that no, I had not touched the thing since the last lesson. I told him that I had absolutely no interest in mastering the guitar. What I really wanted to do was sing in the voice of Billie Holiday, mainly commercials, but not for any banks or car dealerships because those are usually choral arrangements. The color ebbed from my teacher's face. I told him I'd been working up an act and could use a little accompaniment. Did he know the jingle for the new Sara Lee campaign? So Dr. Allison McCracken is Associate Professor of American Studies at DePaul University. I think we have a couple of her former students here tonight. Is that true? Yeah.
I didn't even recognize you.
Yeah.
It was a minute ago.
Her new book, Real Men Don't Sing, Crooning in American Culture, was recently published by Duke University Press. She's a cultural historian whose work focuses in particular on the intersection of gender and the media in American popular culture, and her writing about television, radio, and music has appeared in several scholarly books and journals. She's also written numerous articles for the online journals Flow and Antenna, and she's currently working on feminine gendered fan communities at conventions and on the social media platform Tumblr. Please welcome Dr. Allison McCracken.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to Jane and my former students for recommending me to come. Hopefully you will not regret it. I'm really happy to speak for Illinois Humanities, and she actually asked me at a good time because I just published my book with Duke in September. So I'm really excited to talk about it. This is actually the first time I've talked about it in about 10 years, and so this is a new PowerPoint for me, which is the warning, because I went a little busy with the PowerPoint. So if, lots of complete sentences and things. So you can ignore a lot of that, or you can read it or not, or you can bring it up during questions, because I probably won't cover everything that I've written, but it's a 450-page book. So I thought, these highlights are important, but so are these. So, I figured you guys are going to take and leave what you want to, so that's perfectly fine. The book is actually, I'll give you a little bit tonight of a story of the crooning culture wars, which happened in the early 1930s and were basically a reaction to anxiety about the popularity of romantic crooners on radio, men like Woody Valley, who was the first pop idol in America, who sang very pleading romantic songs with megaphones or microphones, and caused a lot of anxiety and concern that the voice of America was becoming, as they said, effeminate. So there was a big backlash, and it really sets up the structure of the stigma of femininity and femininity, I should say, that actually follows male pop stars still to this day. So we're looking at something that's lasted really for about 75, 80 years. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that might be changing and how the paradigm might be starting to shift in the last 5 or 6 years or so. But certainly sets up, these structures were set up at this period, and that's really what I'm talking about. And it's about, basically reinforcing cultural hierarchies of gender and class that happen. So, and to a degree of race, and that's something that I'll get into a little bit more. So, this works. I haven't used a clicker before either. There are all these firsts that are happening tonight. So, just the qualities that represent this particular stigma are what I've referred to as the crooning paradigm that gets established. You will notice our lovely, everyone can recognize who these guys are?
What if we can?
I don't know.
Who knows?
One Direction.
One Direction, oh my God.
Actually, it was on the block and we'd be busy.
You guys are not Directioners? I don't know if I could talk to you. Yeah, so the qualities. Femininity, femininity, which are related or described often in the press as having high-pitched emotional vulnerability, romantic songs, youthful beauty and or androgyny, and privileging of attention to female fans, which we know is bad. Suspect sexuality, perceived gender transgression, arrested development. This Freudian term comes back and was established during this period. Artless commercial product, having a mass versus a class appeal. This is a term that we use a lot in media studies. I don't know if you guys use it as well, but having mass appeal means it's for the masses and therefore dumb people, right? And having a class appeal means it's for discerning audiences. So often that gets associated with something like quality television, for example. If you watch Breaking Bad, you're great. If you watch reality television, you suck and are stupid. The idea of also being inauthentic and artificial because of commercially produced, right? So auto-tuning, there's a word that you probably know. Like, that's bad. So yeah, okay. And exclusively, again, female feminine fans. We know that's not true, but that's what gets focused on, and the perceived mindless of hysteria and emotional excess of said fans. So these are the four really big categories in terms of how the stigma works and how it still sort of gets regurgitated in the press kind of constantly. So, history of the male pop star. We really see in the 19th century and early 20th century broad popularity of what we would see young male singers, boy singers, countertenors, boy sopranos, and this is in working class, primarily mass media. It's not necessarily middle class, and I'll talk about that later. 1920s, rise of sound mass media. This changes everything, and I'll talk more about that, but this is to give you a little bit of a timeline about what we're going to be doing. Birth of the microphone crooner and modern crooning in the 20s because of mass media. First pop idol, 1929 to 1931, and then the culture wars and backlash, and where everything is solved, all the problems are solved when Bing Crosby comes on the scene, and we have the crooner paradigm takes place, and he is the representative, the only crooner that survives, and I'll talk about that. If you need a definition of crooning, this is the dictionary definition of crooning. It's basically microphone singing in the soft, low voice. So,
Microphone singing in what?
a soft, low voice. And romantic songs generally, so popular sentimental songs in a low, smooth voice, especially to a closely held microphone, and I'll talk about what that means as well, because that's something that develops. So this is to give you a little bit of the very fast all history of male singing, working class in the late 19th and early 20th century. Basically, during this period, we see this kind of singing aligned with the cultural feminine. And sentimental songs, romantic songs, mother songs. One of the big sort of song genres in the 1890s and early 1900s is the mother song. And one of the historians of popular songs said basically every single rhyme in the 1890s and the 1900s is rhyming mother with lover. I love my mother, I love her, mother. So lots of those kinds of songs. There's also a conflation of the romantic and the maternal, which we'll talk about. But in any case, this is Mr. Quigley here, who is described in the sheet music as the sweetest boy tenor. This is very typical of the kind of sheet music you'll see with this nice young lad, very attractive young lad, who sings a song called The Beautiful Pathetic Ballad. And I love that they call it pathetic, which meant, of course, creating pathos, right? Creating emotion, but for us just sounds pathetic. Don't Send Her Away, in which it's a prodigal daughter story, and he takes the side of the mother who wants the daughter to return. He's the son, and he's like, oh, please, let her come back, and the father's letting him go. So he's always aligned with the women of the family and with the feminine. These are mostly working class boys, immigrant families, usually second generation, Irish, Italian, Jewish boys, ethnic and religious singing traditions. We also see African-American boys in minstrelsy come up in the 1890s and early 1900s, but primarily these ethnic immigrant groups, in part because there are these traditions of singing that they already have established. And if you look at singers today, it's actually, they're coming from the same groups in a lot of ways. It's kind of amazing. So, they were active in different forums in minstrelsy, which gave way to vaudeville in the 1890s, early 1900s. Song slide presentations, which were you put on the lyrics just like this, and people would sing as a community, and the boy would lead them. Water boys, which are support systems, which is very interesting because song pluggers are people who are promoting popular songs, and Tin Pan Alley, which is the main music industry, would hire boys to basically go to large theaters, and after the star would sing the song, they would stand up and continue to sing the song and get people to sing the song with them because they were so adorable that everybody wanted to sing the song. So they would sell a lot of songs. And then when their voice changed, they would get fired. So they usually started when they were 10, 11, 12 years old. Most of these boys didn't go to school. So youth and attractiveness, very important. High voice, very important. Gender blurring, often audiences, identification and desire overlapping. Around the turn of the 19th century, there's a period in which the young boy especially becomes this, what they call it, the sticking point for fantasies. This is Martha Vicinius' term. If you think about Peter Pan becoming really popular at that period, a lot of lesbians really invested in this boy character, why I wonder. And also a lot of queer men who were at that point forming communities, fairy communities, pansy communities in major cities. So you get this boy who becomes like this really important figure, and also obviously women, again, of all ages, very invested, but also men because men have been raised with the boy tenors as well. But there's this period around the turn of the century where we really see this focus on the boy as the primary sort of sticking place for fantasy. And we should say also with working class aesthetics, in terms of performance aesthetics, working class aesthetics are all about making people feel things. That's what it's about. Because you have to consider the use value of entertainment is really important. You want to get in and out as quickly as possible because you don't get paid much and you don't have a lot of time. So you end up going to vaudeville and you watch a couple of acts, right? Or you go and you sing a popular song, you go to the Nickelodeon and you see some short films and you pal around with people, you go to the saloon, whatever. So it's about making you feel something. Either usually emotions like crying if you're listening to these kinds of boys sing, but also, laughter, thrills, and chills, that kind of thing. All pulp genres are coming out of working class aesthetics. Basically, boys are young men who could hit really high notes and make people cry. And if they didn't make people cry, you would fire them. So that's what they were supposed to be able to do. That's what they were hired to do. And so these kinds of singers were the most valuable singers. For every major working class and lower middle class venue, and I should say vaudeville is kind of mixing the lower middle class sort of clerical groups with more working class groups. So, listening, we get to listen now. Is Bindu here? Yes, she is. Oh, good. Okay, so I'm not going to make you listen to much of this because it's an acoustic recording and it's going to sound bad, but this is countertenor Will Oakland singing Wait Till the Clouds Roll By in 1910. He actually was one of the very famous former minstrel who became a concert performer. Minstrelsy starts to wane in the early 1900s, and he was recorded a lot and also very, very popular. So even though his greatest years of fame were 1908 to 1914, he also won Favorite Radio Voice in New York City in 1925. So this is right before really the crooning takeover. And he was strongly supported by the police, as Variety said. So again, they were basically saying Irish people liked him. So this is the audience for these singers and who like them. So we're going to play just a little bit, just so you can hear a little bit of how sort of high pitched his voice is. It's not particularly pleasant because of the recording, but we're going to do just a little bit of that. Thank but that's the pitch that everybody really wanted to hear. Now I should say, these are working class aesthetics that I've been talking about. Middle class singing aesthetics were very different. And by middle class, I mean also upper class, because we're talking about opera, and we're talking about concerts, we're talking about professionally trained singers. So what happens with high culture, it's very interesting. The middle class aesthetics for singing and sort of masculine codes for singing get established in the 19th century. They get established in terms of mass culture in the early 20th century, which is what I'm going to talk about. But that's because, you know, at a certain point, the middle class starts to worry that they're taking over. So the 19th century, we see a strong reaction against the popularity of castrati. In the 17th and 18th century, that's the Italian opera singers who were castrati, and who were incredibly popular as gender transgressive figures as well, and as Lotharios, and there was this huge reaction against them. Like, no, we need to masculinize, you know, opera and concert performance. We got to get away from that. So these new standards of singing reflected middle-class white masculine norms. They replaced a lot of the tenors in major operas with baritones. They made the female figures bigger. They made the female parts bigger in opera so that they could get away from these guys playing these parts. So it was very interesting kind of backlash. So they redefined singing. They said singing should be the result of years of professional training and study, and the voice should be thought of as an instrument. The object of singing should be education, enlightenment, uplift, musical appreciation, basically intellectual and moral effects. Very much about the definition of middle class aesthetics in terms of any kind of theater or any kind of entertainment venue is always about intellect and morality first and pleasure later, because they don't like pleasure. They're really concerned about pleasure and people feeling things, because they might, you know, form unions or something. So they're really, or have sex, which is the other thing they don't really want to talk about. So emotion is not primary. So we're seeing that real difference. Music should be performed, singing should be performed in a class venue with evaluation by discerning peers, meaning in case you got too emotional or too outside of the confines, someone in the room will prevent that from going any further, and you will be devalued because of that. The personal benefits: you develop strong muscles. Those diaphragmatic muscles are going to be great and serve you well. All about bodily discipline. They actually talk about singing in terms of an athletic activity that will build your muscles stronger. So this is all white masculine discourse from the late 19th, early 20th century that's all about very connected to social Darwinism and eugenics and civilizing discourses. You know, we're different from the primitive savages. We're all about, you know, emotion and pleasure and sex. And no, we're up here. It's also useful for, if you have emotions, you can release them in a controlled, contained environment through the standard song structure, which you cannot abandon, your refined technique, and your critical audience. Sounds like so much fun, doesn't it? Okay. So that's important in setting up why the crooners were such a problem. So the rise of the crooners, 1920s. Prehistory. Crooning is a Scottish term, croying. Eventually comes, apparently the word comes from Germany, and Robert Burns brings it over to Scotland. It basically means an intimate sound, a low murmur, a lament, or a wail. Like so many things in the US, it becomes a word that is transferred to the US through minstrelsy, that wonderful institution that I'm sure you've all heard of. So the most popular performance venue in the 19th century. So the figure of the Mammy is very important in minstrelsy, and the crooning Mammy songs become really, really popular. Part of the plantation song genre of the late 19th century, which is all about supposedly freed slaves, and again, this is minstrels playing slaves, freed slaves who, of course, think being freed sucks and want to go back to the plantation. And they really miss their crooning Mammy. This is really, I mean, God. So all these songs are about that. And you might be more familiar with the 1920s version of this, which is Al Jolson singing Mammy songs, because that's what those songs are all about. You know, I want to go back to the plantation and Dixie and Mammy, and she loved me so much. And he gets, he jazzifies them and eroticizes them in an interesting way that doesn't happen in the 19th century, but I should say, like, this particular idea of the Mammy continues for decades and decades and decades. I mean, it doesn't disappear. It gets accompanied by another definition, however, because we see a lot of crooning songs sort of shift to romantic songs instead. So this idea of, okay, we're taking crooning from minstrelsy, we're redefining it as something that can be an intimate act in a romantic courtship. So we have men singing to women. That's what crooning can be. And a lot of this has to do with changes in popular music at the time, about Tin Pan Alley, which is the main music industry conglomerate, wanting to diversify and broaden their audience, and saying, well, if we do romantic songs, we're going to get, you know, a broader audience. If we do an ethnic song or a minstrel song, we're starting to lose audience, and we want to get that broader audience, so everything becomes about romance. Also, they started to get backlash in the 1910s from the NAACP, formed in 1909, that started to really be focused on censorship, and saying, or they wanted to, they're like, no, you can't sing coon songs anymore, they're horrible. So basically, they moved and said, okay, we'll just do generic courtship songs, and you know, that's good, then we'll make everybody happy. So there was some pushback from below that didn't make a difference in terms of how these songs evolved. And I should say, there's a wonderful period in the 1910s where a lot of black women are singing crooning songs and redefining the Mammy character in some ways as a more sexualized character. And it's very interesting because it's like this proto-blues, like Bessie Smith's singing this stuff, you know, in the 1910s. And this is before the blues, but they kind of dropped the children out when they started the blues in the 20s. But it's very interesting that you get that kind of maternal eroticism with Mammies, but that's another story. In any case, it's very interesting. So crooning gets defined as romantic. Everything becomes erotic and romantic by the 20s. Everything. It's like it's just every song genre gets redefined as romantic. So 1920s, radio invents modern crooning because the early radio equipment was very fragile. And so if someone sang and projected into it with their muscles that they've been, you know, working on for a really long time, they're going to break the equipment. They basically blasted the equipment and the equipment blew up. So they needed singers who actually would sing softly, who primarily used head voice rather than chest voice. And that is going to be people who are not trained singers, generally. And that turned out to be basically song pluggers. And song pluggers, again, are people that are employed by the popular song industry to sell songs. So they would drive around to different radio stations and they would sing, and it was all basically for commercial purposes, but they became really popular because they sounded really good over the radio. They didn't sound good generally in any other venue, but the radio, I mean, they sounded not quality, they sounded good, but they weren't, you know, like that kind of technical quality that we were talking about, or even like they couldn't project their voices the way like Al Jolson could. So it's interesting. So they became kind of really well known because they could sing really simply, they had really good enunciation, they were really kind of slow and soft, and people at home, especially we have to think about radio as domestic listeners, felt that there was this kind of companionability, this kind of ease, right? They weren't being shouted at like they're in a large theater and in a public space. Instead, they were being like talked to in this kind of conversational tone and this very smooth tone. And people thought, this is great, you know, I really like this guy. So a lot of them started to be really well known. This was, of course, very upsetting to a lot of critics at the time, which we'll build into the backlash against crooning generally. But they became associated with the word pop, so basically something that was mass, right? And what happens is it gets associated just with this kind of singing, and it still remains associated with just this kind of singing, something that is seen as primarily commercial, and having no other redeeming qualities. So, but they were being popular. Then, 1925, the record industry, which is a major conglomerate, far bigger and more important at this point than the radio industry, decided, okay, clearly radios sound good. Radios were using microphones. They were using carbon microphones at that point. And so there was electrical aspects to what was going on. So the record industry is like, people seem to like this, maybe we should do it, because they were using, as you just heard, acoustic instruments, which were not as good at conveying those kinds of intimacy of the voice and lyrical clarity. So they said, okay. So they get on board, this changes singing forever. It's amazing because it completely upends all of the masculinist standards. I mean, we can even look at acoustic recording as something that at least fulfilled to some degree this idea of having to have muscles, because I don't know if you guys have seen an acoustic recording horn, but it's a big horn and you have to sing into it with a lot of force. You have to have muscles to sing into an acoustic recording, and you have to also often sing the same song over and over and over, because if you made one mistake, then the particular recording device wouldn't work because you're making a cylinder at a time. So you had to have a lot of stamina. It's very interesting because even if you read now about acoustic recording, people use the word like, you have to have stamina. I mean, it's this whole stamina, and you're penetrating the horn. I mean, they actually say things like that. Okay, because the horn is shaped like, a vagina or whatever. So it's very masculine. So we have this projection. And then also, obviously, people like Al Jolson and people on stage are also using energy. They're at least doing the American idea of working hard and having that sense of muscles and working on a stage for a live audience, right? So all that on some level is, that's okay. Electoral recording, it's better if you don't have muscles at all. It's better if you just are really soft and really interior and really comforting and really, centered on your own personal feelings and getting really into the narrative. You did not have to have training. You did not have to have projection. You did not have to go to vaudeville. You did not have to do any of those things. So we have a lot of characteristics that emerge: soft, slow, breathy, nonsense syllables, scatting, what I call feminine endings, which is basically ascending at the end of a song, so it's still open, and it's like a soap opera. Sliding notes, which you'll hear, very intimate. So, and also, but it really suited that kind of domestic environment, because even though they had records in domestic spaces before, they weren't live, and this way you develop this really strong connection and relationship with the person. So, and as a result, like in 1925, as soon as this happens, within 3 months, all the major records, all the top hit records are all like crooners. And it's just kind of remarkable. It's like everyone else is out of a job. They really don't like crooners as a result of this. There's a little bit of concern about that. Like, you don't need training? You don't need anything? No. You don't even have to play an instrument? No. I mean, a lot of them did, but they didn't have to. Most of them used ukuleles. Do you guys, because they're tiny, and they're really easy to learn, and a lot of the spaces were really small, so they're like, okay, well, we'll just play that. Anybody can learn how to do that. 1920s. So, another big shift that's happening, which is going to be really important to crooning, is that vocal mimicry and ethnic impersonation, which has been the primary performance mode of the working classes, along with these kinds of, Irish tenor ballads and sentimental songs, moves entirely to an aesthetic of sincerity. So it increases market segregation in certain ways, but it is kind of transitional as well. So we're moving during the 20s to this aesthetic where it's like, I really mean what I'm singing. This is me. It's not me performing a character. It's not me performing a particular, ethnic group or whatever. It's me performing me. It's personalization. So we really see that starting to happen. But interestingly enough, everybody crooned during this period. Crooning was pervasive across race, across class, across ethnicity. It was seen as a way of singing, as a style of singing, and everybody did it. So we will see that narrow at a certain point, but at this point, that's what it's like. So, okay, so we're going to listen to My Blue Heaven, a little bit of My Blue Heaven. How many of you have heard of Jane Austen or My Blue Heaven? Because this is one that's fairly well known. You may only know it from MASH, because it's played constantly at the, of course that also signals my age, doesn't it? It's constantly at the beginning of MASH. So Jane Austen was the biggest pop star of the 20s until Green Valley. He was from the South. He was influenced by a lot of different kinds of music. He was never a minstrel, and that's a really big thing, switch with crooners. Crooners weren't minstrels. Generally, they didn't come from minstrelsy. They were a new generation. So he was very interested in bringing a lot of these different kinds of influences together. And today, he really will sound country, and he gets called country, but country didn't exist at the time. It was actually called hillbilly or old-time music, and that's not exactly what he's doing. And he was considered a pop star. So you'll notice this particular song is considered, it was a very popular song and considered kind of like the typical crooning song, so it's talked about in textbooks a lot. You'll notice simplicity and accessibility of the narrative, breathiness is used, falsetto, murmurs, nonsense syllables, which is also called scatting, whistling, feminine endings. We won't get to the feminine ending, but he does it. Can you play a little bit about that? And I really love
birds are wending back to the shelter long. Each little nest they love, nightshades falling, lovebirds calling. What makes the world go round? Nothing but love. When whippoorwill calls and evening is nigh, I hurry to my blue heaven.
That's very, very. So interestingly enough, like he is completely marginalized, and you know the historians who do about jazz or Crosby or whatever actually call him fey and anemic and all of these things. It's just like, okay, but it's interesting because you can sort of see why that would be a feminized sound. I mean, he's fast fading. He's not forceful in the way that he sings. He just lets things kind of fade out. He was very well known for that. So now we talk about ballet. Rise of Rudy Valley, first U.S. pop idol, 28 to 29. This is him with his band. He was very known for relaxed poses, for curving lines, for not stiff positions, right? I mean, it's so easy. So he was a jazz band leader. A lot of crooners came out of jazz bands, and what was interesting was jazz bands, and this is, I should say, white jazz bands and sweet jazz bands, which primarily had to include singers because their audiences, who were mostly collegiate at that point, or young people, working class people, wanted singers. And especially women wanted singers, and so they had to hire singers, and they hated that because they wanted the attention to be on how their instruments and how musically proficient they were. They didn't want to have this pretty boy singing these songs, and he didn't even know anything about music or be able to play an instrument. But this is where the band singers come from. They were forced on jazz musicians by the audiences. We talk a lot about how consumers really are producers of media, and this is absolutely true with pop singing and the pop idol, which never would have existed without the audience really pushing for it. So he was Irish-French, middle-class New Englander. You'll hear that in his voice. He was a saxophonist, not a good one apparently, but he sang with also a trademark electrified microphone, or megaphone, which you saw at the beginning. He found regional fame in New York City radio. At that point, radio stations would broadcast from hotels, and a lot of the jazz singers would be playing in hotels, so they broadcast, and so people heard ballet. And they just were transfixed. Like people around New York City and the region, New Jersey, and they're like, oh my God, what is this? And it seemed very different to people who were listening. Because, you know, all jazz bands sound sort of alike if you listen to them, the 20s jazz bands. But his voice was different, and people really liked that. And also, he didn't use brass instruments, so his melodies were very smooth and were very soft. And people really liked that. And then his voice, very languorous, very gentle, he draws out the notes, he slides the notes, you'll hear that. Again, feminine endings, slight vibrato that he kind of deploys. He often strains for the higher notes. He's not a great singer, which is why it's interesting. It's interesting in one response, because it's the way he's singing, which was new. Emotionally intense, very consistent direct address. So everything is you, I love you, over and over and over. And constant love songs, very romantic, very sincere and devotional. So I'm going to have you listen to Deep Night. This is a very famous recording. It was actually used in Bonnie and Clyde and My Own Private Idaho because it's associated with sexual deviance by this point. His live appearances, he started appearing live because his radio audiences wanted him to, and this caused pandemonium. So this is the first instance where you get, you know, these very demonstrative, especially women, just screaming their heads off and throwing stuff at him. Which, when you see him, it's like, this is kind of amazing, and that's why it's this moment, and you know that this thing is happening. Tabloid coverage. He becomes a national star literally within a month. This is, you can read this while we're playing his song Deep Night. This is Martha Gellhorn, who was a famous journalist at the time. I think she's writing this in a satiric way, but it's actually very close to exactly what people describe listening to ballet is like and watching ballet is like. So can you play a little bit for us?
Lighting a place of love.
and he barely reaches the notes, and that's one of the fun things about his appeal. Okay, so his persona then became something that was identified with the romantic crooner and defined the pop icon in a lot of ways. So I use this as the cover of my book because this is the iconic pose of the crooner. It's a submissive pose. Eyes are closed, mouth is open, head is back. This is blissful surrender. This is a feminine pose. You can see crooners do it today. Like this is, you know, as soon as you get in there with the eyes closed and the mouth open, it's all over. This is about appealing to women, especially, he was very appealing to women. He appealed to men as well. There wasn't a stigma yet surrounding him, but women were particularly demonstrative and were directly addressed, so that's important. He was seen as a very feminine figure called the It Boy at the time, but he was also part of a very 20s male femininity. I mean, we probably would have called them, what's that word, metrosexual people used in the 90s, right? In the 20s, all the boys were metrosexuals. They were all in the F. Scott Fitzgerald mode, so they were all worried about their clothes, and they were all clean cut and polite, and they had soft, you know, he had very soft hair. His fans were obsessed with his hair. And if you ever get into anything regarding boy bands or, you know, pop, it's all about their hair. Like if they cut their hair, like, you know, it has to. Beatles too, remember the Beatles and the hair? No, you have to have hair. Again, this kind of feminization and wanting to touch and being assertive, being able to be assertive with this particular person. He loved dancing, he loved women's leisure, beach tanning, he loved films. He said he liked spending time with women a lot more than men, and he constantly talked about how much he loved women and how much he wanted to serve women. He reversed then roles of gender and sex because he was passive and submissive. They would talk about him as giving him the joys of a plate of fudge, was the same as Rudy Valley. He was very responsive. He wrote to them. I don't have time to show you the service positions, but he used to play underneath women's legs and talk about fast tonguing, so this is the iconography of the period. And in fact, oral sex was being discussed in the marriage manuals at the time, that men are supposed to be genital kissing their wives, and not a lot of them did it, but Valley's like clearly using that. Very interesting. So he provides this relief and alternative to the companionate marriage norms because everything was about unity. Women's public roles were being narrowed after they had won the vote for a number of reasons that have to do with the 20s. So we move from this point where women are being discouraged from having, you know, professional lives, from having any kind of same-sex friendships. They were being, this is the beginning of suburban isolation. So they were told that they should have sexual fulfillment and they should have an erotic relationship with their husbands, but they shouldn't initiate anything. Should never be on top. Astride is the word they use. Should never be on top, should not initiate because that's going to emasculate your husband. Okay, so one of the things Valley did was allow him to feel assertive, right? Because they would write him letters and say, I want to pick you up out of that speaker. You know, I want to pick you up, I want to touch you, I want to do these things to you, because I'm not allowed to do that. So it provides that kind of gender transgression. Also, it's very clear that women were masturbating to him. Like, they write the way that they write the letters. There's even a sex study that of 2,200 women at the time that says women can have orgasms just by fantasizing and not touching themselves at all. And they, you know, they said that too, so it's really funny. But yes, I mean, it's very much about their kind of sexual and romantic uses of him, which often they said, you know, there's a third person in our relationship. And I should say, again, he was a commercial icon, so a lot of commercial culture was saying this is what women need to do, right? Invest in these romantic figures, right? That'll be good. That'll help women want to be romantic and get married and all these kinds of things. And it's like, they didn't really expect this kind of over-investment in a figure like Valley and have him be this alternative to an alternative masculinity to the narrowed, you know, masculinity that existed in their lives. So he provided that kind of transgression for them. He was a figure of identification and of desire. Again, this kind of resistance of Freudian divided those two things, which we start seeing in the 1930s. We also see the rise of the homo-hetero binary, which a lot of Valley fans completely reject. It's only developing in the middle class at this point, where people are starting to identify as heterosexuals, right? We had homosexuals being defined well earlier, but hetero is important in this binary. So for example, one fan will say to him, when you sing Lovely Lady, that is me, that is the way I feel. And it's unclear whether she means she's the lady, or she's loving the lady, and there's all that kind of ambiguity going on, or whether she identifies with him, which a lot of women did. So, oh yeah, I was going to show you a little bit of him, but I don't know that we have time. How are we doing on time? Great. Okay, we'll show a little bit of Valley. This is from a movie called Glorifying the American Girl, 1929. He's singing I'm Just a Vagabond Lover, which was his big hit.
It's Rudy Valley. It's Rudy Valley. Rudy Valley. Rudy Valley. Rudy Valley. Rudy Valley. Rudy Valley.
I can't forget the night I met you. That's all I'm dreaming of. And you call it madness. Ah, but I call it love. You made a promise to be faithful by all the stars above, and you call it madness. Ah, but I call it love. I keep repeating, my heart is beating for you constantly.
This is what everyone sounded like at this time. I mean, crooning became huge. It's in all the films. It's in all the records. This sound is everywhere. And they have loudspeakers. They have all this kind of stuff. So everyone started, the cultural authorities are like, okay, mass media sounds like this. This is a problem, right? So crooners attacked as effeminate and emasculated whiners. And you can read that the Cardinals starts out with the attack, and I'll talk why that is. But I mean, the idea that they are actually appealing to base sexual emotions in the young. They profane the name of love songs. They're revolting. They're immoral. They're imbecile, slush. They're sensuous and effeminate and luxurious. One of the interesting things that we see, we'll see in the early 30s, is a separation between sensuousness and effeminacy, because the idea that something that's effeminate could also be erotic becomes threatening, so it gets separated out. But at this point, They're both of those things. They're paganists. This is my favorite. This is actually one of my chapter titles. I prefer a riot, even a galvanic, hiccoughing action, he's comparing jazz and crooning, to a supine sinking into the primeval ooze. Passive. It's not racialized, and one of the interesting things is that we move again from this period of, and I'll talk about this, popular culture as being concerned about racialization to concerned about gender transgression. And there are reasons for that. Crooners are compared to quote-unquote Orientalism because of their passivity and seductiveness. And so they're sort of at the quote-unquote Orientalism is at the opposite spectrum of African Americans. So it's like they're over here, and that's clearly not American. Even jazz is better than that. At least you have some energy and working for you. And what's interesting is that of course that's how the standards have developed. Jazz is much more easily as a music enfolded back into this idea of critically valued production. Crooning never is brought back in. It's always seen as in some way critically devalued because of the gender transgression. If you can't make it masculine, it's not going to be critically evaluated well. So, okay, except for Crosby, which we'll talk about. So this is the shift that I mentioned, and there are a lot of reasons why. But by the 1924, there are immigration laws that prevent further immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. So concerns turn to white assimilation and preserving white racial superiority through reproduction, primarily. We already have segregation in place, and there's a lot of really, obviously, structures that are continuing that. And in popular culture, we see the segregation of records specifically as race records. They're actually negative. They're actually brought out of mainstream music and said, this is a music that is just for this group of people, produced by this group of people. Now, of course, obviously, other people listen to that music. But the idea that they could be in some way segregated out, and Carl Hegstrom-Miller talks about this as kind of creating a musical color line, so that a lot of the musical diversity and the blurring of lines and the passing of various races and genders in terms of popular music really stops, and it gets segregated. So that, also women who are crooning stop crooning. They start being called torch singers. Black women start being called only blues singers, like you can't sing anything else. And of course, we're wonderful, but only allowed to be narrowly focused on one particular genre. Could not sing pop, for example. So this starts to happen. So the focus is really on, we want heteronormativity, we want racialized reproduction, and so in popular culture, we're worried about anti-heteronormativity, right? Like we're worried about gay people, queer people, women who might be lesbians, all of those things. Everything that happens in the 50s starts in the 20s. That's what you have to get. So, music industry segregation, as I mentioned, and essentialism, only certain bodies being authentically able to produce certain sounds. Voice becomes tied to bodily truth. Now, that's helpful if you're singing a sincere song. It is not helpful if people decide that you're too feminine and therefore you're gay and shouldn't be allowed to sing at all. So, this is what happens. The growth of the feminine media and masculine as nationalism at this time concerns that the voice of New York is feminine. The Catholic Church becomes very involved in regulating and masculinizing the mass media. They want to prove that they're masculine. Everyone wants to prove that. And so in the Depression, it's very important. So all the crooners are Catholic, like all of them. So they're like, well, what are we going to do? The Cardinals attacking us directly. And they did that for a reason, because the Cardinal and Catholic Church wanted to police their own constituents, who were huge crooning fans, were in major urban areas, right? And huge Catholic majorities. And they all love crooning. And so the Catholic Church said, you can't love this anymore, you can't love these guys anymore, and plus, guys, you can't sing this way anymore. Even though you've been doing it for centuries, because Irish tenors and Italian tenors had been primary, as I said, really popular singers. No, and this is why the Catholic Church comes down so hard on crooning and becomes very involved in censoring any kind of effeminacy to prove that they're going along with these tides of masculinity and to get certain things that they want from major industries, including like the film industry and the radio industry and the record industry. Growing influence of social and health sciences. Crooning is injurious to vocal instrument and morals. Freud's idea of arrested development becomes really useful when talking about crooners. High-pitched, sensitive male voices are pathologized in every way in social scientific literature and health literature. It's literally seen as unfit, something that's going to injure your voice. Engineers weigh in. Crooners are distorted, unnatural, artificial. They're dependent on technology, obviously. So they develop microphone technology that favors baritone voices. It's kind of amazing. So popular culture, how do they respond? The problem is that the public didn't go along with a lot of what the Catholic Church and these other institutions were saying, and they defended crooners, and they said, you know, we don't care if they're feminine, or we don't really think they're that feminine. They even said, you know, they're gender in-betweens, that's fine. This is the working class public who are like, this is fine. It's really the people at the top, again, the cultural authorities who say, you know, this is not fine. We can't have these standards be national standards. So, as a compromise, the mass media defines crooners as non-normative and bad romantic risks, but redeemable if they quote-unquote grow up. So there are two categories that they use. The first one is they say the crooners are pansies. They're ridiculous, they're elitist, they're silly, they're out of touch, they're possibly gay. Reporters constantly ask Valley, how are you going to prove you're a real man? They asked it. They also, the other possibilities, they're playboys, they're seductive, they're predatory, they're irresponsible, they're homewreckers. This is early Crosby gets associated with the playboy and Valley with the pansy, and of course, this is Crosby in a famous film in which he's playing a drunken playboy, basically playing himself in Going Hollywood in 1933. And in Valley, there's a film that's basically a complete satire of Valley that's very popular called Crooner, and you'll notice very much clearly putting him in a pansy position with the eyeshadow and it's all there. So, and they separate out, again, the effeminacy and the eroticism, right? They're now separated out. And the pansy is really what will continue on as the primary way of thinking about them. So Bing Crosby comes in and he defines, he sort of picks himself up and he says, okay, I have to separate myself from this, and how do I do that? So he enforces the new masculine standards, he sort of defines them. A lot of early crooners disappear, or they grow up. Valley becomes like a showman, like a variety leader on radio. Crosby survives for a number of reasons. A playboy persona is a lot easier to redeem than a pansy persona, because it's like, oh, I was a guy, I was a wild boy, I sold my wild oats, I was drunk all the time, whatever, but now I'm like a family man, and it's great. And that's a lot better to have a kind of, you know, sexy past for a boy than saying, you know, I'm a pansy. That, you can't redeem a pansy in America. So, new technology is developed. Directional microphones specifically are developed. This is why the songs that we've listened to thus far, they seem a little bit less close to us, as pop songs generally feel closer. That's because they're on condenser mics and not directional mics. Directional mics are invented 1931, start being used heavily in 1932. They are much warmer because if you get close to a directional mic, first of all, it's just one direction, which is why you get that warmth. It's called the proximity effect. Probably people have heard that term before. It's fairly well known. If you get close to that kind of microphone, you get a proximity effect. That is that kind of close-up sound and that kind of warmth that you get from that. And it naturalizes the technology, because that's still the standard that we're used to with popular song is the directional and the ribbon microphones. So there's no more claims of artificiality, because the older crooning records sound artificial to us, because this is what sounds natural to us. We've become used to it. And it really worked for Crosby, because he's not a particularly warm person, like as a singer. He did have a kind of vulnerability and sensitivity, but the microphone gives him warmth. And I talked to a lot of engineers, and they're like, well, the microphone made Crosby, everybody knows that. I'm like, no, they don't. His main biographer, Gary Giddens, it's a wonderful biography in a lot of ways, but he completely ignores the microphone shift. It's amazing. It's like he doesn't even recognize that it happened, and it's so essential to Crosby's stardom. Because everyone's talented, but not many people become stars. Crosby also diversifies musically, sings songs about love, about home rather than love, less sliding, no vulnerability, sings hymns. He lionizes country over city living, rugged individualism, plain clothing. He goes to Hollywood fairly soon, and that's a whole other story, but he becomes a Hollywood star fairly early, which really helps insulate him from a lot of the attacks and the problems. He marries a blonde, he has sons immediately, heteronormativity and patriarchy right away. Actually, one of the magazines said, well, how are you going to prove you're masculine? Bing Crosby had twins. It says that. Okay. White superiority. He revives minstrel songs, he uses blackface in film, none of the other provers have done that, very nationalistic. Religious faith, Catholicism, he plays a priest, going my way. He becomes an icon of the church when he doesn't want to play a part because he thinks it's too sexual. He gets the Catholic Church to make them stop and make him not have to do it, which is amazing because no one's ever able to turn anything down in Hollywood. But because he had the Catholic Church with him to do it. He had ridiculous or feminized co-stars in his film and doesn't look at women while singing in his films. It's kind of amazing if you look at his films, like he's sitting over here singing and she's over here, not looking at each other. So, all right, so this is a typical transitional song for Crosby. He starts doing these cowboy songs in 1933. This one's called The Last Roundup. He's pulling away from the romantic crooning era. He's using a Western theme, male-identified subject matter, cowboys. Not a love song. It's about someone who's resigned, who's going to die. Not romantic or desiring. You can hear the proximity effect at work, the warmer sound. But still, it's a transitional, so you can still get sliding notes and feminine end, and kind of a lot of use of the Irish mortgage, which is this little that he does at the end of notes. You'll hear it. Anyway, okay, a little bit of that.
I'm heading for the last roundup. Gonna saddle old Payne for the last time and ride. So long, old pal, it's time your tears were dry.
That's not too much left, but all right, this is the last big thing, I think. So we want to see how these vocal standards have persisted, and there are a bunch of ways that I talk about a lot more in the book, but in terms of the music industry first, we have this sort of high-pitched male voices being marginalized in popular music from this point on. It's very interesting because there's a countertenor voice, or a high falsetto voice of a native Hawaiian singer at the beginning of one of Crosby's biggest hits. And Gary Giddens, his biographer, says, oh, I'm sure people were really worried at the beginning of this song that Crosby had joined the castrati. So it's directly connected. And I'm like, well, maybe people like that sound, and they don't get to hear it very often. It's all right if people of color use that sound. They're connected to certain kinds of genres, and they're segregated out from mainstream pop. So it's, this is how it works. So to be taken seriously, to become the real deal, pop stars must grow up by working in a masculine coded, therefore critically valued musical genre such as hip hop or rock. Femonophobia becomes really obvious in straight and gay rhetoric, is still constant. Especially, I was looking at stuff from the 2000s and looking back at the beginning of Justin Bieber and Justin Timberlake, and it's literally, Entertainment Weekly, for example, and People Magazine, both of which are very liberal, pro-gay magazines, continually refer to Bieber as a girl. It's this constant femophobia, and you also get that in the gay press because there's this worship of masculinity everywhere. And so when, for example, Justin Timberlake starts working with Timbaland and doing a hip-hop record, all these reviews are saying, oh, he's grown up and now he's the real deal, because that's authentic as opposed to what he was doing before. So music history races early crooners, refers to them as fey, weak, effeminate, prissy aesthetes with flaccid styles. You gotta love flaccid styles. These are direct quotes from jazz historians. I love it. Crosby's voice is virile, full-bodied, and having hair on it. And natural. And his persona is an everyman, of course. But there are broader injuries here in the decades since then that I think really haven't been talked about that much. I've been talking to a lot of sociolinguists about this because it's only started to be studied, this kind of perception of people as gay because of their voice. So all young men with high-pitched voices, speaking or singing, were thus stigmatized and bullied as gay. Many endure years of institutionalized correction for their vocal disorders in public schools. Freudian rhetoric is constantly employed in these. And this is the Handbook of Speech Pathology, the primary handbook, in 57, 71. This goes through the early 90s. So the resemblance to the female voice suggests a lack of masculinity. The pitch a person uses reflects his sexual identification. Such individuals are psychologically different from other members of their sex. The social linguists in the 1990s and 2000s have confirmed this continual cultural association between homosexuality and feminine-sounding men. So vocal cues, which of course also describe crooners, are still being used, include high pitch, using falsetto, sliding speech, known as glissando, the rise and fall of the voice, really good intonation, or clarity in the voice means you're gay. I talked to one sociolinguist and he's like, yeah, you know, the straight men mumble, and that's the thing. Breathiness, clarity. There's no evidence for this connection. However, what is interesting is that they're starting to do research, and there is a connection between gender nonconformity in childhood and voice. So that's not connected to sexual identity or behavior, but it is about, you know, kids who cross-gender identify, and boys who cross-gender identify with their gender. There's a lot more being done on that. They've also done surveys on actors, studies of actors, and every actor in Hollywood basically raises his voice when he plays a gay character. So it's seen as something that's endemic, except people ugly. So, so I think that there's a paradigm shift perhaps happening in the last 5 or 6 years that has given me some optimism that we're maybe moving away from this. So I'm going to have you listen to Defying Gravity, this recording from 2009, and I used to play this for my students when we were studying American popular culture, and I couldn't think of something to play for them that would give them a sense of what this kind of voice, soprano, alto character, what he would sound like, because the recordings aren't that good. So I played them this, and I assume you guys are going to know what this is, but we'll see. So, do you want to play for
me? Something has changed within me. Something is not the same. I'm through with playing by the rules of someone else's game.
Too late for second guessing. Too late to go back to sleep. It's time to trust my instincts. Close my eyes and believe.
It's time to try defying gravity. I think I'll try defying gravity. Kiss me goodbye. I'm defying gravity, and you won't bring me down.
Okay, you guys know?
Wicked.
It's Glee. It's Chris Colfer from Glee. It's the first year of Glee. And they had known, Glee wasn't big yet, so they didn't know what it was, but they were like, is that a boy or a girl? Because we like this sound. This is cool. We've never heard this before. We don't know what to make of this at all. So it was really useful, and it also made me realize, like, the first time I heard him sing on the show, I literally almost had a heart attack. I haven't heard this in how long? This sound, it's, oh my God, it's back. And then, of course, he became huge, especially with women. So we see this real switch in 2009, sort of pushing the limits of vocal diversity again in mass media, and I do love that it really comes from television, and especially reality television and musicals like Glee, which most people at this point considered, you know, completely insane. But it's very much about network television being seen as this degraded form anyway, and yet a lot of the most interesting, queerest vocal work is coming out of television. And specifically starting with Adam Lambert on American Idol, really turning it into a queer space, and that coming from the audience, again, and people just being obsessed with him and voting for him. It was the time for that to be able to happen, because the generation that was coming of age is much more gay-friendly, less femophobic, much more inclusive of transgender and genderqueer, and this was, I think, a real manifestation of that, but it also, because it's a audience-supported program, he was able to become the star that he was with this kind of glam artist falsetto stuff going on. To the extent that Simon Cowell had to say, well, this isn't my taste, it's my personal taste, but everyone else was like, it's ours. So we get Chris Colfer here with Darren Criss and playing his boyfriend, who's the crooner on the program. And I love this picture because this was one of the Entertainment Weekly featured pictures of them. And of course, they look like they're in the 20s. And they have the ukulele, and they have the whole collegiate look that they're sporting, and they've got the softness, and they've got the easy homosociality stuff going on. And it's just amazing that that kind of look becomes part of the bringing back that voice as well. So you have that, and you have a massive fandom for queer voices. We were just talking about pentatonics and a lot of the a cappella voices, which also have a lot of high-pitched voices as well. I really find that the voice really, really interesting in bringing on diverse voices, especially at the beginning when you have these blind auditions. Often, just breaking down a lot of the segregated barriers of the music industry and proving that, anybody can sing. You can do a lot with your voice. You can sound like a lot of things. And you can sing in a number of different genres that people haven't been able to do before. So I really was inspired by this, and in fact, I think I finished the book because Chris Colfer existed in the world. And it's very interesting because he's become especially this nexus for just real, again, desire and identification overlapping in every possible way, like this kind of romantic, erotic, spiritual, everything. I think people understand that gay men love divas, like that's understandable, like to the culture. Like, oh yeah, okay, that's great. But people don't get like why women and feminine identified people love these boys and why they're obsessed and why they recognize them as these gender transgressive figures and these offering opportunities for that kind of transgression, that kind of assertiveness, and that otherwise they wouldn't be able to do still. I mean, today we still have these kind of structures against women being sexually expressive. So I think that he's doing that. But it was very interesting. There's a New York Times article about him that says, I don't understand, the writer says, I don't understand why he has so many female fans when there's no hope of consummation. This is the New York Times. I don't think that's what it's about. No, it's about, women power. It's not about that. So I wanted to end with Judith Butler because I really love this quote because it talks about the importance of fantasy in breaking these boundaries. So fantasy is now the opposite of reality. It is what reality forecloses. And as a result, it defines the limits of reality. So I feel like we're maybe starting to push these limits a little bit with what's happening with these